So, morning year 8, we are on lesson number 31, natural selection. So, who is this guy? And he is not Father Christmas. I'm going to give you two clues and see if you know. So, did you know? Did you know it was Charles Darwin? So, one of our most famous scientists. So, way before David Attenborough, he was an English naturalist and he travelled all around the world. And it was actually on the Galapagos Islands in 1835, so nearly 200 years ago, that he made his discoveries about life, evolution, and came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection. So we know who discovered it, but what is evolution? So evolution is in fact how things change over time. So evolution started originally with a single-celled organism. We call that a unicellular organism, something very similar to bacteria. It was found in water, and over time it gradually became or evolved into a multicellular organism, and then eventually over thousands and millions of years it eventually evolved into multi-complex organisms like we see today that actually came out of the water and started to live on land and in air. And we know this because of the fossil records. So the fossil records are basically a history of life on earth. That's how we know there were dinosaurs, and they are the remains and traces of ancient life forms. And the fossils basically tell us a story of what used to live on this planet before humans evolved and took over. So, what I want you to do, I want you to write down um, the story of evolution here. So, just bullet points in how it starts from a unicellular organism up to life as we know it today, and just a very brief summary of what the fossil records show. So probably the easiest way to describe evolution to you guys today is the evolution of a mobile phone. So you've probably, even in your lifetime or seen with your parents' phones or your family phones, how we've gone from sort of a what we call a Nokia brick, something like that. It's evolved into the flip phones, and obviously looking up to our smartphones that we use today. Even amongst iPhone and Samsung, there are many, many different kinds of phone, and they have evolved over time to have different apps, different uses, and some things are better for some people, some things are better for others. So we have seen in our lifetime the evolution of phones according to people and how they use them, and that is also what has exactly happened in the animal and plant kingdom, how tiny tweaks and tiny changes over time has actually ended up with a smartphone now that looks completely different from the original telephones, which was sort of 150, 200 years ago. So here's the evolution of a horse. So 50 million years ago, horses were tiny. They were literally the size of a ruler, and they had four toes. So you can see here quite a small skull. As we roll forward to today's horses, so this is a horse sort of similar to today, 3 million years ago. It has now increased to a size of just under 1.5 meters, and it's got an incredibly large skull, and its foot has evolved from four toes to three with one massive toe in the middle, to obviously now to the hoof that we know that horses have today. So this is not the evolution of a phone, but the evolution of horses. And it is due to the fossil record that we have been able to see this very clear evolutionary path from original horses to the common horse that we see today. So what I want you to do now, I want you to have a look at these drawings. These are very famously named the Darwin finches. And I want you to have a think about what has changed in these finches? What are the differences? And then have a think as to whether these differences would just apply to birds or whether they would actually apply to other things. So you probably noticed that all these finches are in fact very, very different. So obviously they are all birds, they all have wings, they all have beaks, but in fact they have adapted to their environments. So on the Pinto Island, the first bird here has a very large beak. That is for eating fruit. You've got the Fernandino Island finch, which has a much smaller shaped beak, and that would eat much smaller fruit, pretty obvious because it's smaller. You've got the Santa Cruz Island finch here that has a tiny beak, just wide enough to pick up worms. And then finally, we have our last finch here that has a very tapered, very thin, very fine beak that enables it to pick up seeds. So they are all finches, but they are all quite different. And this is one of the things that Darwin noticed as he travelled around the Galapagos Islands. As he went from island to island, he saw very similar type animals, but with slightly different adaptations according to what they ate, where they lived, and the island environment. We will go on in the next slide to have a look at some of the tortoises that he also found, which again had very different adaptations to their shells depending on what island they lived. So here's just three examples of the giant tortoises that were found on the Galapagos Islands. And you can see they have very, very different shaped shells and very different shaped length necks. So you've got the saddle type giant tortoise, which obviously was adapted to reach fruits, leaves, berries much higher up. So its shell is tilted at the back to enable it to stretch its very long neck right up to the higher branches. And obviously, those that had a longer neck were better adapted for that island, and they were the ones that survived and passed on their genes to the next generation. And over time, obviously, these have ended up with a species of tortoise with a very long neck with a shorter shell that actually has it tipped like a saddle at the front to enable it to lift its neck up. You've then obviously gone to the other end, you've got the domed type shell. This obviously is a tortoise that is still very successful eating and foraging from low leaves and on the ground. So it has no need for a long neck because it has just stayed adapted to eating off the floor. So evolution is everywhere. It is all around us in all animals. And we could probably guess what's going on here. So we've got our red fox that lives in amongst our community and is very rarely seen, but is everywhere and normally comes out at night. So it has a darker coloured fur compared to its Arctic fox cousin that is only found in the snow. So obviously, if we had our red fox in the snow, that is going to be very obvious, which means it is far more likely to be eaten, or the pups to be eaten by polar bears and things like that, because they're not adapted to their environment, so they are far less likely to survive than the Arctic white fox, which is very well camouflaged and can hide out and obviously also sneak up on its prey because it is hidden in amongst the snow. So it is a much better chance of survival than the red fox. But again, if we had the white fox in our community living amongst our houses, it is going to really stand out. So again, it won't be as successful as the red fox, which is much more likely to survive, breed, and carry on the gene for red fur onto its offspring. So in the last lesson, we looked at DNA, genes, and inheritance. So now we're going to transfer that knowledge to evolution. And evolution is actually a change in the inherited characteristics. So if there is a benefit like white fur to the Arctic fox, that trait, that characteristic is passed on to the next generation. So it inherits the characteristic that enables it to survive in the wild. And that is evolution. It can take thousands, millions of years. It basically depends on how quickly the reproductive cycle is of that particular organism. So if it's an insect or something like that, or bacteria, it is going to show up or evolve much quicker than, say, something like an elephant that has a very long reproductive cycle of over 2 years. So the quicker the reproduction rate, the quicker the evolutionary path or the inherited characteristics can be seen in the species. So, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. What I want you to do, I want you to write down the bullet points of the key things needed for evolution as we go through the next couple of PowerPoints. So, the first thing that Darwin's theory requires is variation. So, if there's not variation, then there is nothing for natural selection to act on. So whether that's tall, small, fat, thin, long beak, short beak, furry, fluffy, white, camouflage, that is variation. So first of all, point one, we need variation in species. We then need offspring. So we need more than one offspring so that obviously we can have the survival of the fittest. So if there's more than one offspring, then obviously only the fittest will survive. It is the fittest that survive that are best adapted to the environment that will pass on their particular variation to the next generation. So if it is fur color that gives an advantage and that offspring survives, it is more likely to pass that on to the next generation, and that particular color starts to dominate those organisms. So we've now got variation, then we've got multiple offsprings for survival of the fittest to act upon. Point three is that we now pass on the genes. So these are the inherited characteristics that are passed on genetically in the DNA found in the nucleus. And then point four is that over millions of years, it could eventually lead to a new species, which is why our planet is now dominated in lots of different kinds of animals and plants. So, for example, there would be an ancient ancestral cat that has now speciated into tigers, lynx, lions, and our domestic cats that we have at home. So that's point four. And then finally, point five is that sometimes as our DNA copies itself, it does things wrong and there are mutations. And these mutations can be an advantage to the animal, they can be a disadvantage, or to a plant, obviously. And again, if this mutation enables them to survive in the wild, it is again passed on genetically to the next offspring. So you should now have 5 things on your list for Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. To put in very simple terms, nature will select the species or the adaptations of that species that are best suited to the environment that help it to survive and pass it on to the next generation. So, in simple terms, if you're in the Arctic, you'd want to be fat and furry, and that's going to give you an advantage over thin with no fur. If you lived in the water, if you had gills or could hold your breath for a long time, for example, with whales, if that gives you an advantage that you could stay underwater for longer and fish for longer or find food, that is the thing that's going to be passed on to the next generation. So it is survival of the fittest, something that gives you an advantage over your brothers, sisters, or another kind of organism. So if something has given a particular organism an advantage and that is passed on and on through generation after generation, eventually the parts of that species that aren't so good at surviving will eventually be killed off. I want you to use the information on this slide just to add to your information and check that you have everything down and that you do understand it. We don't want loads of writing, but there are key points here. So first of all, the key points for natural selection, which is Darwin's theory of evolution, is first of all we need variation. The variation is then caused or related to its genes. It is these genes that are best suited to the environment that are more likely to not only survive but to be passed on in reproduction to the next generation. So we need variation. These are due to genes, and then those genes of the best survivors are passed on to their offspring. Any animals that are poorly adapted or plants that are poorly adapted are less likely to survive and will be wiped out. And over many, many generations, these tiny, tiny, weeny differences all add up to change the species or even evolve into a new species. So go through this and add to your notes and check you understand. First of all, we need variation. Then, if they are best suited to the environment, they are passed on to the offspring, and eventually we end up with a new species. So here we have the peppered moth, and before the Industrial Revolution, so before factories and cars and things took over, most peppered moths were a very pale colour, and this helped them to blend in with the silver birch tree bark that you can see here. There were very few peppered moths that were actually the dark colour, and this was a disadvantage as they were easily seen on the silver birch and therefore easily eaten by birds and predators. So the pale coloured, white coloured moths were much more likely to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation. So here we have our evolution of, we've got our variation that caused the silver gene. The silver pale coloured gene was then passed on to the next generation, and obviously that came to dominate the species pre-industrialization. However, after the Industrial Revolution, trees started to become very clogged up and dark with soot and pollution. And this meant that the dark moth all of a sudden had an advantage. It was suddenly far more camouflaged than its paler white coloured moth, and therefore was much less likely to be eaten. So over time, the dark coloured moth began to dominate the species, and actually the pale coloured moth became much rarer. What we're seeing at the moment, as our countryside is getting cleaner and the atmosphere is getting cleaner and we are having less pollution and soot from our factories, we are noticing a switch back again to the dominance of the silver white coloured moth. So this is evolution that in our own lifetime, seeing it switch to a darker coloured moth during the industrial dirty human revolution, and now we're switching back to the silver coloured moth as our pollution gets less and our environment becomes much cleaner. So can you make a note about the two kinds of moth and in what circumstances they will dominate the landscape? So the silver moth is camouflaged for living on silver birches, where the dark coloured moth is far more likely to be found in cities where the bark is much darker, or in woodlands where it is not very easily seen. So it is far less likely to be eaten and less likely to pass on its genes. So if the environment is clean or open or bright, you are going to find the silver moth. And if the environment is dark or quite close or shadowy, like in a woodland or in an industrial area, you are going to find the black peppered moth dominates. So make sure you have a good example of these two different kinds of moths. Although they are the same species, they are just two different varieties of the same moth. So, well done, Year 8. That brings us to the end of our lesson on natural selection and Darwin's theory of evolution. If you would like to know a little bit more, there is a clip which I will email out to you. It's on YouTube. It's the story of Darwin. It's about half an hour, well worth watching if you are interested in science and doing biology and maybe making a career out of biology. Definitely worth a little look there. And also for our keen biologists, there is a little tiny clip, just a couple of minutes long, about the peppered moth and the fact they have now sequenced the genes and found the genes that code for the black and silver peppered moth. Well done, everyone.